In terms of governance, there are about 50 people running the country, and they're pretty much all in the Treasury. The Treasury is not just powerful, it's socially extremely exclusive. We've created some kids who are born into good fortune, good life chances. Millions of kids out there in the wrong social class, in the wrong parts of the country, who are born into despair. Britain, and especially England, is the most centralized country in the Western world. It's of the same order of magnitude as Eastern Europe in the time of the communists.
Paul Collier, welcome to PoliticsJOE. How are you?
Thanks very much for inviting me.
It's an absolute pleasure. We're glad to have you on.
For somebody my age, it's a privilege, believe me.
Very grateful for you being here. Before we get into your book, Left Behind, tell us who you are. What do you do?
So I'm a professor of economics and public policy at Oxford. Pretty fancy. I've got a knighthood, fella, right? Labour gave me a CBE.
Very good.
The Conservatives upped it to a knighthood.
Stop it.
I don't use it.
Don't you? I will. What would be my proper term of address for you then? Sir?
Yeah, I think
Sir Paul.
You should be kneeling, I think.
Yeah, kissing the glove.
Just don't.
Maybe
right?
at the end of the conversation. Let's talk about the book, Paul. Left Behind, here it is. A New Economics for Neglected Places. What makes somewhere a neglected place, and where might we find them in the UK?
Well, I grew up in one. So although I'm pretty fancy now...
Knight of the Realm and all that, yeah.
Both my parents left school when they were 12. My dad was a pork butcher. My mum was a shop assistant. That's how they met. And I grew up in Sheffield. Sheffield's now the poorest city in the whole of England. 500,000 people scuppered. Right? So all my relatives are still there. I've seen life at the wrong end of the stick, even though now I'm at the right end of the stick. Yeah? I'm at the right age, and I'm in the right place. Oxford is sort of the fancy end of London. It's got all the fancy without the problems. Yeah? So I live in a gilded cage. At least I'm conscious that I live in a gilded cage and that an awful lot of other people don't.
So tell me then, for people that are born into these left behind places, give us a sense of the disparity, if you like, between someone who's born in Sheffield and someone who's born in London. You don't have to be that specific, but I'm using it as an illustrative example. What does it mean practically?
Yeah, it means very different life chances. What are life chances? They're the chance that if you start from, say, the poorest 40% in society, you end in the better off 40% in society, right? Something like that, right? So life chances are more divergent by social classes and geography, more divergent in Britain than anywhere else in the developed world, right? So there's more inequality in life chances in Britain than in America, right? We think of America as pretty unequal.
We absolutely do, yeah.
We think of a lot of Europe as pretty unequal. Nothing like. So we're off the map, unequal life chances. What does that mean in practice? It means that if you're a middle-class kid growing up in London, your chances of going up in the world are 6 times higher than if you're a poor kid growing up in Sheffield. 6 times. And we measure that just by the age of 32.
Wow.
There's a lot of the future left beyond 32, where the differences are going to get wider and wider and wider.
When you look at by cohort as well, you're breaking it down, people who were born in a certain, 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. What trend do you see there, the sort of relationship between the different generations then?
Well, as it happens, Joe, if you're born in the 1950s, you got it made, which applies to me.
Congratulations.
Joe, which decade were you born in?
90s.
I've got really bad news for you, right? But I'll cheer you up at the end.
So, great. Thank you for that.
People born in the 1960s are now worse off, age for age, than the people like me born in the 1950s. Huh? So go from the decade of the 1950s to the decade of the 1960s, they're worse off. And it shows up in things like, do you own a house?
I do now, yeah, actually, but I know I'm
so that's the 60s. Now we're going from the 60s to the 70s. The generation in the 70s, age for age, are worse than in the 60s. If we go to the 80s, age for age, the people born in the 80s are worse off than the people born in the 70s, which were worse off than born in the 60s, worse off than born in the 50s. You were born in the generation, the 90s.
Gilded generation, so I'm told, yeah.
And it's not gilded, but because it's worse off, age for age, than people born in the 80s, who were worse off than people born in the 70s, who were worse off than people born in the 60s, who were worse off than the generation born in the 50s. I really feel your pain, Joe, but now I'm going to cheer you up.
Are you?
As far as we can tell, the generation born in the noughties, the first decade of this wonderful millennium, right? The people born in the millennium, in the first decade of the millennium, are going to be worse off than any of them.
Oh, great, good.
So you could cheer up.
Yes,
right?
yeah, a little bit, nothing like a bit of perspective and comparison to make yourself feel better about things.
I've got 3 kids born in the noughties, in the first decade of the 21st century.
Yeah.
And they're all worse off than you, Joe.
Is there a sense of, just to make it personal for a second, we'll come back to the sort of economics of what's going on here, but I feel like your perspective as someone who is kind of at the top of that tree of comparative decline. Tell me about your perspective when you do look down on a younger generation. Obviously, you've got skin in the game because they are your own children. To see that the things that perhaps previous generations took for granted, i.e., that standards of living would improve, advances in technology would mean a bountiful plenty of economic gains and gains in modern medicine and quality of life. And in actual fact, there's almost this, I would call it like a key component of the social contract has essentially failed.
Yes. This is where I put on my hat as Professor of Economics and Public Policy at, don't forget, Oxford.
Yes, I won't forget that.
Yeah. I just want to remind you, it's Oxford, right?
Good, yeah.
Right.
Is that going to be a recurring theme throughout this? Professor, also a Knight of the Realm, and also born in the 50s, so deal with it, pal.
So, as you say, I've got skin in the game because I've got 3 kids born in the first decade of this brilliant century. And because I'm a professor of economics and public policy, and I see this huge gap. Most kids of my kids' age expect, and this is the survey show, they expect their lives to be worse than mine. And that is phenomenal. Right? I mean, we've had miracles of technology from when I was born to now. And we're still getting miracles of technology. And so these miracles of technology should be able to drive living standards up for everybody. They are driving living standards up for the gilded few. Right? But you've got to be very gilded, and you're very few in Britain. We've created some kids who are born into good fortune, good life chances, and millions of kids out there in the wrong social class, in the wrong parts of the country, who are born into despair. And we see that. A very good book by Angus Deaton called Deaths of Despair.
I know it well, yeah.
And unfortunately, that's happening in the poorest provincial places in Britain. The two I single out, I've got relatives in both of them. Blackpool on the west coast, Grimsby on the east coast, right? These are places where life expectancy is actually falling, right? And it's just, it fills me with fury that the gulf between what's feasible, which is prosperity for everybody, and what's actually happening to so many people is so wide. That fills me with fury. Right?
I think it should, yeah. I'm really glad you've raised that. And for viewers who aren't familiar with the concept, it's Angus Deaton and another colleague whose name currently eludes me, who wrote this book, Deaths of Despair, which basically documents the increase in deaths by suicide, poisoning, that could be via alcoholism, drug use, and the condition of chronic, permanent pain that is starting to crop up amongst this demographic in society. I think it's sort of white, middle-aged, and men in particular, that essentially, and it feels a little bit abstract to say this, that via kind of a loss of a sense of meaning in their lives, whether it's from worthwhile work, worthwhile family relationships, the almost fabric of society decays, and this extraordinary phenomenon that life expectancy is now decreasing amongst this group. And the reason I find it, well, I'm glad you raised it, is because my question has always been, can we make that corollary to the UK? And you look at perhaps Scotland and Glasgow and drug deaths there, and maybe there's a little bit of it there in the same way you talk about Blackpool and Grimsby. But essentially, what it does is challenge the entire underpinning sort of the philosophical foundation of the organisation of our economy. That essentially, we live in a meritocracy, and that certain factors notwithstanding, we do our best to create the circumstances in which, if you work hard and you get on, you will progress. And obviously in America, they would call that the American dream. Here we might call it social mobility. That essentially,
we ain't got social mobility. That's the trouble.
So it's a lie.
It's a lie. It's a lie. We just haven't got social. We don't live in a meritocracy. In a meritocracy, your abilities would create your opportunities to rise. Right? I was a fluke, even in those days. Right? Not many people from Sheffield got to Oxford and Harvard and blah blah blah.
And a Knight of the Realm.
You missed one. You've missed one that I'm proud of, which is Glasgow.
Okay.
Glasgow, and I was given an award which I'm truly proud of. Just about a year ago, I was up in Glasgow, and they gave me an award called the Adam Smith Medal. Now, to be English and get the Adam Smith Medal, that was pretty cool, awarded by Glasgow.
What was it for?
It was for Left Behind. It was exactly the message of Left Behind before the book was out. But I gave a lecture there on exactly this, that Glasgow is a big city that has missed out. It's got these deaths of despair. It's been staggeringly neglected. When you fly into Edinburgh, they have a big banner saying Scotland's International Airport. Actually, Scotland's International Airport used to be Prestwick, which is the Glasgow airport. But the SNP, the Scottish Nationalist Party, is basically an East Coast phenomenon. It's an Edinburgh and that whole East Coast up to Aberdeen. And they neglected Glasgow.
This might be a slightly tangential point, and we don't have to spend too much time if you don't want to, but you mentioned that, so I just wanted to talk about sort of religious groupings around the UK and whether or not they map onto maps of electoral support, right? Because much is made, particularly in the UK, of transposing sort of non-conformist religious groups, the Methodists or whoever else, and that translating to sort of support for the Labour Party, most strongly, particularly in areas like Wales and the Midlands in the UK, but others as well. And I would just kind of invite your comments, perhaps, on the sort of the longer-lasting sort of political phenomena, political consequences of the way that sort of religious belief mapped out across the UK?
Yeah, I mean, the Methodists were the sort of disruptors of the 18th century. And my own family was very much part of that tradition. So I'm very fond memories of it. I think nowadays I don't see the religious divide as being anything like so crucial here. It's crucial in some other societies. In America, you've got a big Catholic population, and that divide, Catholics, non-Catholics, matters quite a lot. Much less pronounced in Britain. So I think that I wouldn't want to emphasize the religious point now. I think the class and geography have become the fundamental drivers in Britain, because we've got uniquely so much activity concentrated in London. London is where we've got government, it's where we've got the courts, it's where we've got the media, and it's where we've got finance. And of those four clusters, probably the most important is finance, because finance determines, and especially risk-bearing finance, determines where you get job growth. In Britain, 2/3 of all the venture capital is risk-bearing capital, right? 2/3 of it is in London and it's hinterland. And so 2/3 of the job growth, proper job growth of the future, is going to be in London and its hinterland, unless we address this fundamental inequality in the allocation of finance, risk-bearing finance.
You write that a lot of this regional inequality and other ills has a lot to do with, I'm quoting you here, Treasury orthodoxy.
Yeah.
Can you explain to me what you mean by that?
I can indeed, yeah. So I've talked about the financial concentration of power in London. There's a second concentration of power, which is governance, if you like, or misgovernance. And governance is concentrated in Whitehall massively. You probably don't realise, but Britain, and especially England, is the most centralised country in the Western world. I mean, it's phenomenally centralised. It's of the same order of magnitude as Eastern Europe in the time of the communists, right? Totally centralised power. And as Andy Burnham, the mayor of Manchester, recently said, there are really, in terms of governance, there are about 50 people running the country. And they're pretty much all in the Treasury. And so immense amount of concentration of power in the Treasury. Now, the Treasury is not just powerful, it's socially extremely exclusive. In two layers, all of Whitehall is socially exclusive. Right? To get it to thrive in promotions in Whitehall, you need to be from a good university and a good school, right? Meaning a public school, right? There's a fascinating testimonial by a former permanent secretary. Permanent secretary's top of the pile, right? It was the top civil servant in a ministry. And he said, I felt an outsider in Whitehall. Why did this guy feel an outsider? Because although he'd been to a good university and a good public school, he hadn't been to Oxbridge, where
Where
I'm a professor, remember?
Yes. Oh, thank you. Yes, I've forgotten actually.
Yeah. So, that was astonishing that he felt an outsider just because he
Yes.
hadn't been to Oxbridge.
Yes.
Good God. And then it gets worse, right? Because we've now been able to measure the social composition within Whitehall. And indeed, he was an outsider because it's dominated by Oxbridge types. But the Treasury turns out to be even more socially exclusive than the rest of Whitehall. It's run like a monastery. How does monastery work, right? In case you were thinking of applying, you're a bit late to get into a monastery, right? You apply when you're a teenager, right? And to get into the Treasury, you go fast track. And fast track means you take an entrance exam, which is really for people who've just finished their master's degree. Now, it could be at Oxford, could be at Cambridge, could be at London School of Economics. One or two other places that are almost acceptable for fast track. But fast track, you go in with your first job. So you've done very well. You've got a first at the undergraduate level, then you've got a really good performing master's degree from a really good university, and then you go straight in. Right? That's fast track entrance. One characteristic you think you have is you think you're pretty clever. Right? Well, let's not mince words. You think you're very clever. Right? Many of my students, I taught in the Department of Economics as a professor for years before I moved to public policy. So a lot of my own students went straight into the Treasury.
And no doubt very clever after having been taught by you, Paul.
Absolutely, because, yes, I don't like to mention it, but so you get the message, right?
Yeah.
So the one thing these kids haven't got is any experience of doing anything. Yeah? And so they've got zero experience, but they think they're very clever. And then they're given some task by the Treasury. The Treasury obsessively scrutinizes the spending ministries, and somewhere beyond the spending ministries is the great unwashed, the local governments. Oh my God, right? And so you scrutinize them to death. Yesterday, at the Bureaucratic school in Oxford, we convened about 20 people from local government. And very rapidly, they united on impassioned anger against the Treasury. Right? Because, as they say, one had a wonderful story. He was online with 30 people from the Treasury. He was one, they were 30. What were the 30 of them doing? They were scrutinizing how he was planning growth in his city region authority. 30 of them scrutinizing him and critiquing him, and one of him. And he said, it did strike me that there was somewhat an imbalance of allocative talent here. I could have done with a lot of them, their brain power,
yes,
helping me.
Or even the resource.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yes, better the resource.
Yes, indeed.
And indeed, these kids are less useful than they think they are because they haven't got any experience. And so that's the bitter reality, that these are overconfident kids who are tasked. You know, one was tasked with planning bus routes for Manchester. Had he grown up. Had he been in Manchester?
Had he taken a bus in Manchester? Yeah.
Probably not. So he might have taken a train to Manchester, except that I just was on the line with somebody from Manchester yesterday who was supposed to get to the meeting in Oxford. He said, my train is moving at 2 miles an hour, and I won't be able to get to my meeting in London and then get to Oxford. So he didn't show up. Right? But the point of that is that trying to plan bus routes in Manchester, planned by a kid in London who's no experience of anything, is bound to go wrong. That degree of micromanagement centralization, the 30 kids scrutinizing, this is madness. It cannot work. And the tragedy, so why does the problem get deeper? Because, of course, that fails. Of course, the bus routes all go wrong. People start to complain and so on. It's not just the bus routes. It's the whole strategy for training of people, jobs, job growth, which we hopefully will come back to, is planned by these kids in London who know nothing. And so it's bound to fail. And it does fail. It's failed repeatedly. At some stage, Joe, we'll get to the story of HS2 and the railway planning that the Treasury's been doing for the last 10 years. But that's a little story we'll save for the moment.
Yeah, we'll save.
Yeah. But since it's bound to fail, it does fail repeatedly. And so then what does the Treasury do? They've got to diagnose why is everything going wrong. And they have diagnosed it. Right? The reality, the proper diagnosis, will be to say that we've got a massively over-centralized, blundering bureaucracy. Right? Their diagnosis is that they need to take back control. They need to have more scrutiny, more concentrated power. And so over the last 5 years, staffing in Whitehall has increased by 25%. Now, the last 5 years haven't been great for the British economy. Right? In fact, they've been, a technical term is shit. Right? So try and think of occupations which have increased their employment by 25% over the last 5 years, apart from Whitehall. Right? I can only think of one, Joe. Funeral directors. That's been a booming sector because life expectancy in poor places is falling, and COVID helped things along a lot. So,
and there's a corresponding lack of productivity growth since COVID that's corresponded with that increase in size. We're still not at the same level of productivity in the civil services before the pandemic, right?
No, that is unfortunately true, including the sectors it manages, like health. Right? We now know that, for example, some things we can measure, like the number of operations performed by surgeons per surgeon, is down over the last 5 years 12%. Right? I mean, that's quite a lot of operations that aren't happening.
Absolutely, yeah.
Why? Because we've got such a dysfunctional bureaucracy, way, way too highly centralized. So what was the consensus in this group yesterday? It was very encouraging in one sense. We rapidly converged on a consensus, which is that we need to devolve decision-making and money, resources, as you said, devolve it to local government, to regions, especially regions. Not just regions, but regions are a good unit. And we need to devolve a lot of power fast. Power and money. And staff, as you say.
It's interesting, isn't it? I've seen Dominic Cummings talking about this recently, that there's almost a talent filter that ends up being applied to these civil service departments, where essentially you do get some young, bright, talented people who are idealistic and want to achieve things coming into the public sector, coming into civil service. And that effectively the orthodoxy, the bureaucracy rewards people who adhere to it, who do things in the civil service way, achieve progression and move up. And essentially what you do is there are young, talented doers who become demotivated, seeing people that effectively play the HR game to, you adhere to the best practices of the way that people conduct themselves, so you secure promotion, and people that want to essentially move fast, break things, let's see what we can achieve, go, do you know what, I'll stuff this, I'll go and work in a startup, I'll go and work in AI, I'll go and work in venture capital, whatever it is, somewhere where the work is exciting, there's an element of risk, and I can be relatively dynamic in my career. And as a result of that, people who could actually, the people who might be among the 30 who say perhaps we should send some of us to go and sit with Jeff in Preston or whatever, they just leave the civil service and say, you know what, I can't be bothered with this.
Yeah. So there's a phrase in the civil service which I discovered through a lot of interviews. It's called the velvet drainpipe. What's the velvet drainpipe?
I'd love to know, yeah.
It's the pipe that you climb up within the civil service if you want to get. It's the drain pipe you climb up for promotion, the velvet drain pipe. And we interviewed a lot of people in the civil service to discover this. And some people knew about the velvet drain pipe and talked about it quite openly. It was a network of insider knowledge. There's a job coming up here. There's a job coming up here. Talk to such and such. Butter up such and such in advance. That's the velvet drain pipe. Some people didn't know about it. And we've gradually found what was the predictor of whether you knew about the velvet drain pipe or not. And it was social class. The middle class people all knew about the velvet drain pipe and understood that that was the way to get rapid promotion. A network of gossip, and none of the working class ones knew about it. And so there isn't equality of opportunity. It's not a meritocracy, even within the people inside it.
Yeah, it's symbolic, isn't it?
Yeah.
We've recently had a budget, new chancellor, new government. Would it be fair to understand or analyse Rachel Reeves's announcement, her moment of political theatre, as a continuation of or a departure from the orthodoxy that you've just described?
So I was very hopeful. I mean, I shouldn't say it. I voted Labour, right? I voted Labour because the Conservatives really had it coming for them.
Yeah,
right?
I think they deserved a kicking. It would be probably the polite way of putting it. Yeah.
Usually I don't vote for either of them, frankly, but I've been bitterly disappointed because as far as I can see, it's at best more of the same. I think Rachel Reeves seems to be very much captured by the Treasury. And Starmer seems to have just deferred all economic matters to Reeves. And I'm afraid Keir Starmer is not a great communicator. He does have a certain sort of funereal air. You can imagine him as a very good funeral director.
Which I hear is a booming trade at the moment.
Yeah, booming trade, absolutely. And so, it would be funny, except it's not, because it's presiding over tragedies. And these tragedies, remember, are entirely avoidable tragedies. It should be perfectly possible to harness these wonderful new technologies to enable everybody in a society to be better off. That is not rocket science. Some societies have done it. I give examples in Left Behind. there are enough societies that have done it that it becomes a disgrace to see such an unequal society as our own.
What should she do then? What should she announce? What would in the sort of multiverse string theory world where the budget announcement happens and your hope is vindicated and you feel great the next day?
Yeah,
What would that have involved?
it would say, Reeves would stand up and say that we've got far too much power of decision concentrated in the Treasury, and indeed in Whitehall more generally. And so we're going to devolve money and powers to the local governments around the country. And especially we're going to work on regions, because the regions are a big enough unit that you can do economic policy there. And so economic policies for growth, we're really devolving to the regional governments. They should be devising growth plans. And the growth plan for the country will be the aggregate of these growth plans for the regions. And we'll occasionally intervene in case everybody wants to do the same thing. That's not very smart. But actually, we're going to encourage networks of the region's mayors so that they learn from each other. In the book, I describe the greatest economic miracle in human history, which is what Deng Xiaoping achieved in China in the 1980s. And it's worth a few minutes to describe it. Deng Xiaoping, when he came to power in China, China was like nothing like it is now. It was dirt poor. And it had just come out of terrible, ruinous, a thing called the Great Leap Forward, which was a great leap backwards under Mao Zedong. And Mao had contributed his one big contribution to human welfare by dropping dead. And so what did Deng do? He built on a Chinese tradition of competitive entry exams, the Mandarin class. But instead of knowledge of Confucius, he said, what we want is knowledge of economics and science, hard science. And he then said, anybody aged 25 to 35, you?
Me.
In the Communist Party, can enter this competition. That cut it down to 20 million people. He then picks the top 40. Imagine them gathered in this room. And he says, congratulations, you're the top 40 out of 20 million. Feel good about yourself? Yeah. You feel just like those people fast-tracked into the Treasury.
I do, yeah.
You do, yeah. And now he says...
Warm on the inside.
Yeah, and he said, now, for the next 5 years, you are each going to be the governor of one of our 40 provinces. Feel even better. You've got full plenipotentiary powers from me. Your word will be God in that region. Sounds good, yeah?
Yeah, sounds even better.
Yeah. Now, we're going to tell you what we want you to do. You've got to double your region's GDP in that 5 years. And you've got to halve infant mortality. And we in the Politburo have no idea how to do it. But we'll be watching you. If you haven't started an initiative in each of these two things in the first 6 months, you're permanently thrown out of the top 40. You'll never get back in. So, off you go, Joe. You're heading a province, let's call it South Yorkshire, you've never been in. Right? And have you ever been in South Yorkshire, Joe?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Okay, that's good.
I've been there, yeah. So you're eminently qualified then.
Yeah,
off you go.
Great, right, off you go. So you've got to double its GDP in the next 5 years, Joe, and halve its infant mortality. What are you going to do, Joe? Panic?
I'll probably get to work, I imagine, yeah.
Are you going to say, I know what to do?
No.
No, you're going to ask people.
Yeah.
Right? And that's what they did. These 40 young people, they had the good sense to say, well, if the Politburo doesn't know how to do it, I don't know how to do it.
Yeah.
Right? And so they went and asked people, if you're going to want to halve infant mortality, probably be a good idea to go to some hospitals, right? Say, what, here you are in this hospital. Why are so many kids dying in our region? If you had dream powers, what would you do? And they sketch. If we had dream powers, we'd have done this. Right, my word's God here, that's what we're going to do. Right? And so you get 40 regions, all taking different experiments, right, for that 5 years. By the end of 5 years, and remember, big boss.
Are you Deng Xiaoping in this situation?
That's
you
right.
are, right, okay.
Big boss Deng Xiaoping is watching you. And he's saying, halfway through, what you're doing, Joe, on infant mortality isn't working, Joe, is it? Whereas the guy there recording, he's seems to have done something that's really working for him. Now, it may be that over there is very different from you sitting here, Joe, but all I say is go and have a look. Go and have a look. If you think you can learn from it, bring it back. If you're not, that's up to you. Huh? That's what they did. And Deng's system kept going 8 times. 8 times 5 years. 40 years. It's the 40 years in human history where we see in thousands of years of human history, this is the 40 years, is the fastest fall in human poverty ever. It's the economic miracle of China, taking it from an impoverished society to a middle-income society. That's what was achieved by devolving power, experiments in parallel. Deng also learned from others. First thing he did was go and visit Singapore and Japan. According to Mao's theory, the working people should have been dying in the streets. They weren't. And so he said, I wonder if we could do the equivalent of Singapore in China. And so he devolved power to a coastal city, and hey presto, all along the coast of China now, there are very successful cities. So he learned from others, and he learned by experiments in parallel. Does the Treasury do any of that? Any of it? Does it learn from others? No. Does it enable experiments in parallel within the geography we've got, which could be all the different mayors and their teams trying things? No, they don't. So that's what I would want to see, an announcement that said, okay, we're shifting powers and money to the regions.
I'm trying to think the last time the Chinese Communist Party had representation in the British Parliament and the House of Commons, and I think it was when John MacDonald threw the Little Red Book at George Osborne. I think. You mentioned Singapore, and it's interesting because Lee Kuan Yew and it's kind of assumed this kind of potency and significance, particularly within certainly British online political discourse, as what can be achieved if only, and you essentially. I won't say how best to describe his political rule, because dictatorship is probably the wrong word, but essentially you say, this is what we are going to achieve, and if it requires authoritarian measures to achieve it, we will pursue them. If it requires liberalisation of our economic regulation, we will pursue it. We'll sort of open, pragmatic, evidence-based approach to government. We will essentially pursue whatever is necessary to clear the slums and achieve economic growth.
That's right. So Lee Kuan Yew is another of my economic heroes. There's no two ways about it. He transformed Singapore from in 1961, Singapore was dirt poor, deeply corrupt. Right? Now Oh, it was so poor that it was way poorer, for example, than Sheffield. Way poorer.
It feels extraordinary to say that now, doesn't it?
Yeah, Sheffield is still in the 20th century. Singapore is in the second half of the 21st century. London is at least in the first half of the 21st century. Right? But provincial Britain, when you go round it, it's still in the 20th century.
Tell me more about Singapore. What do you admire about Lee Kuan Yew? What is it when you say an economic hero? Talk to me about that.
Yeah. So he, as you say, he's a pragmatist. Right from the start, he was a good communicator. He'd come to power on a promise of ending the corruption. Well, I work with a lot of governments around the world, some pretty smelly ones, and every government I know, when it says I'm going to end corruption, what it means is we're going to jail our enemies. Our enemies are corrupt, believe it or not, so we put them in jail.
It's convenient, mighty convenient.
Yeah, fancy that. So Lee Kuan Yew came to power saying, I'm going to jail corrupt people. He was lucky. He was a poor man, but he was bankrolled by a rich one. And so when he won power, he gave the rich guy a position inside government, right, as a reward, as one does, right?
It's a done thing.
And then he discovered that this guy was abusing the power to be corrupt. Now, Joe, what do you do? He's bankrolled you for election. If you punish him, the chances of getting anybody else to bankroll you, not very high. So what do, Joe? You say, shut up. Don't stop behaving like that. What do you do?
Well, if you want to be, you presumably throw him in jail.
And that's exactly what Lee Kuan Yew did, right? And people were so astonished that he was thrown in jail, this guy, because it was so costly for Lee Kuan Yew. No one else was going to finance it, finance me and end up in jail. And so it transformed expectations very fast. People started to think, my God, Lee Kuan Yew actually means it. Now that's what we need. That's what we need from Reeves, from Starmer. Something that's very costly for them to admit, right? And I don't yet hear it, right?
Yeah, I'm thinking, what is the sacrificial sacred cow that they could? What is the equivalent? What is the? We mean it when we say it. We will achieve X. We will do Y.
I'll give you one, Joe, but you'll hate it. You'll really hate it.
Will I?
Yeah.
Go on.
Yeah. Okay. So we've committed now to being so green that we're going to be the first country in the world to have only green cars from 2030, electric vehicles. From 2030 on, it'll be illegal to sell a green car in Britain, right? Or produce a green car. A car that isn't green, yeah. Now, turns out that is a suicide mission for our car industry, because our car industry is already declining. It's 10% smaller than it was 10 years ago, and it's collectively less than a million vehicles a year. Yeah? Europe has a car industry of 12 million vehicles a year, and they've committed to a date of 2035. Having said they've committed to it, the main political party in the European Parliament is lobbying to say, delay it till 2037. Yeah? So, and in America, if we look at that great new leader, Donald Trump, when is his date for phasing out electric vehicles, for phasing out carbon vehicles, do you think? No
I don't think he has one, Paul.
I think it's never.
Yeah.
So, basically, who do they appeal to, Starmer and Reeves, in saying we are going to pioneer a commitment to being super green by 2030? I think they're appealing to the main voting bloc within the Labour Party itself, which is a very small group, but it's upper middle class young kids, like my oldest son, who'll certainly at the moment vote Green, and the one thing that might tempt him to vote Labour is this fact that they've delivered.
It's interesting though, isn't it? Whether or not delivery actually matters, because you look at Biden. I think it's probably the textbook case now. Achieves growth that is the envy of his G7 peer nations. Some pretty extraordinary bits of legislation, CHIPS Act, etc., stimulus for the US economy, and it doesn't count a penny.
That's right. It's a tragedy. It's an absolute tragedy. What he wasn't very good at was communicating.
Yes.
And that brings back to the central role of being a good communicator, of coming up with these things that, just like Lee Kuan Yew did, that surprise people, that say, gosh, you've made a sacrifice, and so we take you seriously. Right? So if Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves stood up and said, because of the need to save British industry and the jobs associated with it, which are a hell of a lot of jobs, we're actually not going to be able to deliver green energy at 2030. We are going to align ourselves with whatever Europe does. And alignment with Europe would be the single most sensible move that the government could make in improving our relations with Europe. If we don't improve our relations with Europe, and we're off to a very bad start in our relations with America, we're in danger of being quite spectacularly isolated.
Yeah, I wonder if, you say it, I think closer EU relations is possibly that politically dangerous thing that I think a great many advisors, politicians even, are conscious of, that actually within the Labour Party they want, most of them committed Remainers, second referendum advocates, believe in a closer alignment with Europe, but are sort of politically terrified of pursuing anything else because of the Brexit vote, the ensuing parliamentary chaos that followed, and they believe it's sort of too politically dangerous to pursue that. So maybe you're right, that is the kind of the risky thing, the dangerous thing.
The dangerous thing, yeah.
To do.
If what we've got, and it's is managed decline. I wrote that in a piece recently, and Starmer actually picked that up. He said we cannot go on with managed decline. The first division civil servants, the top civil servants, were absolutely apoplectically angry with him for using that phrase, which
I was with one of them recently. He was going bananas about it.
Yeah. It was my phrase. I was very pleased to see that he's using it. But that's the reality, that is what they're doing, managed decline. And unfortunately, his pick for the head of the civil service, who's the longest serving permanent secretary, looks to me awfully like business as usual. Because is he really going to revolutionize Whitehall? He's, as I say, the longest serving permanent secretary. He can't afford to revolutionize Whitehall because his fingerprints are all over it.
Yeah. No, you're so close to the establishment that you almost look at someone like an Elon Musk type figure, Vivek Ramaswamy. Extraordinary claims that they're coming in with, talking about cutting sort of $2 trillion out of the federal budget and all these sort of things. But actually, if you do intend to achieve radical change, perhaps you do need someone who walks into a Twitter and fires 85% of the staff, because otherwise your business as usual candidates are never going to propose anything. If that is what you want to achieve, they'll never achieve it because they are of and within the system that you're tasking them with reforming.
I think that's unfortunately right. That
Yeah.
you just, if we were doing well, you could afford to have business as usual. And some societies are doing well, like Singapore. Do you know, the most amazing thing is Singapore, even though it is doing tremendously well, they're worried. I know because my book before Left Behind was called The Future of Capitalism. And the most interesting conversation I've had about that book was the head of the permanent secretary in the Communities Ministry in Singapore. And he flew specially from Singapore to talk with me.
Well, you're a knight of the realm, Paul. Professor at Oxford.
I'd forgotten that. Yeah, and his copy of my book was just full of little yellow stickers where he wanted to discuss things with me. And he said, "Do you realise that this book diagnoses perfectly what's wrong with Singapore?" And I looked at him mystified. I said, "I thought it was saying how wonderful Singapore was." And he said, "Oh, yeah, all that's right. Yeah, all that stuff was right, but I'm talking now. And he said, "We've got exactly the problem you pinpoint, which is the class divide between the hyper-successful and everybody else." And he said, "I know because my ministry monitors all the social networks. And so we know that the super rich, the hyper rich, have severed all their connections with ordinary people. And so they've no experience of poorer people, just like those kids in the Treasury have no experience, right?" So I told him, "Look, the reason I know Singapore will fix this is that you're onto it. You're already measuring it. Anything you can measure, you can change. It's called benchmarking. You can just experiment. Some things, try 50 different things to get people to meet socially, and track which works, and then scale that one up." So that's what a successful society looks like. It's always a little bit worried. Are we a little bit worried? Doesn't show it, does it?
I'm a little bit more than worried, to be honest with you.
But
Paul,
I mean,
yeah.
the
Not
Treasury,
much power down here in our basement.
I mean, the Treasury is not worried. It's bragging.
Yeah.
It's bragging. If you look in the newspapers each day, I've trained my class of students to look for the Whitehall brag of the day. And most days there's a Whitehall brag of the day.
What was the most recent one?
I think the funniest one, this finally takes us to HS2.
Oh, you're sort of readjusting in your seat. It's a sort of specialist subject on Mastermind. Yeah. Here we go. Come on. Plug in.
So, HS2, today, the Department of Transport announced that they were working at full pace was the phrase, to get a plan for how to pay for the latest extension to HS2, which is, so the story, we now backtrack.
Full pace sounds quite fast, Paul.
It does, doesn't it? Yeah. Yes. So HS2 has been running for, 10 years. Yes, 10 years. And it was initially going to be a railway which transformed the North and Midlands of Britain. Right? That periodically got axed because it turned out to be very expensive. And if you remember, let's benchmark things. The amount of money that Rachel Reeves raised in her disastrous budget was 40 billion. Right? So 40 billion is a lot of money.
Sounds like it.
Yeah. So HS2 is currently, now that they've cut all the northern leg and cut everything other than from Birmingham to a place called Royal Oak, Royal Oak is unfortunately not a mainline station, and so the number of people wanting to travel between Birmingham and Royal Oak, or from Royal Oak to Birmingham, is not very much. So the trains will at least not be very full, but that's costed at, I think, 67 billion, which you remember is quite a lot of money compared to 40 billion.
Yes.
But because I parodied this ludicrous train route from Birmingham to nowhere, in the budget, Rachel Reeves announced that they were going to extend it from Royal Oak to Euston Station, which was the original plan. And so she put in a few £1 million to start the digging. Now it's been leaked, so that the dangerous news, the disruptive news today, was the leak. There'll be an inquiry going on in Whitehall as to who produced this leak. But it announced that the cost of the rail line from Royal Oak to Euston had now escalated to 9.7 billion. That sounds quite a lot of money.
Yes,
remember?
yes, it does. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost as much as the Gordon Brown aircraft carrier, which is floating in Portsmouth Harbour, and which is proudly called the Elizabeth, though I've rechristened it the Sitting Duck, because sailing an aircraft carrier into dangerous seas, now that there are drones and things, is very dangerous for the crew, right? But anyway, that's a different story. Let's get back to HS2.
Please, yes.
Quite, yeah. So 9.7 billion, that is what having got this leak to cope with, that's what the Department of Transport said they were working at full pace, to get a plan to how to pay for it. When did they start HS2?
I think it was about 10 years ago.
Oh, yes, that's right. So they've had 10 years so far to develop a plan, and it's reassuring that they are carrying on with that at full pace to get a plan for the last little bit.
For the train to actually get into central
For the
London,
9.7 billion, which is chicken feed by most standards.
I don't know about you, Paul, but a story like that, it actually fills me with confidence about the competency of the Treasury orthodoxy. I feel rejuvenated. I feel enlightened. I feel, all fuzzy and warm.
Yes,
inside.
Inspired, warm.
Yes,
yeah, that's right.
Quite.
Yeah. I mean, this degree of incompetence tempered by arrogance is truly
a heady concoction.
Yeah.
But Paul, we're coming to the end of our time together. I've only one more question for you, which we've been quite down on the Treasury and the Labour Party and essentially all of the current locations and sources of power in Britain. And I would like it if we could strike a slightly more positive note before the end of the conversation. So I would just ask you where it is that you divine some source of hope. Where do you look to and feel better about the prospects, either of Britain or other sort of people who are doing good work in economics and perhaps could provide an example for us to look to?
Yeah, well, I certainly look to Angus Deaton and his wife, Anne Case, who was the co-author of Deaths of Despair. I'm proud that Angus Deaton, who is the only living Nobel laureate in economics with the prize all to himself, I'm proud that he has endorsed Left Behind as the winning strategy. And there is a winning strategy. It's not rocket science. It's not genius me. It's you just have to look at pretty well all around the world. There are examples which Left Behind gives of successful places that went down, turned themselves round and rebuilt, renewed themselves. And the key word there is agency. You've got to take agency into your own hands. Now, the tragedy around Britain is that agency needs to be released from this desperate concentration of power in Whitehall. If only Whitehall will release some of that power, that would make a huge difference. I believe once people understand that that's what's going to happen, the anger will be unstoppable.
I think some of your fury and anger may be infectious, Paul. I certainly have felt it over the course of this conversation. I'm so grateful for you to come in and talk about Left Behind. I'd encourage viewers to go and watch it, and I think we'll probably have to have you back for a slightly more detailed discussion of HS2 at some point in the future. Paul
If
Collier.
I can get here.
Yes. If the trains are running, well, you might be able to get to Old Oak Common, and then we'll sort of figure out how to get you from there. Paul, thank you so much for coming in.
Thanks very much, Joe. It's been great.